Every room you walk into, you are already communicating. Before you open your mouth, before you say a single word. Your posture, the way your eyes move, the pace of your breath, the decision about where you stand, all of it is sending signals that the people around you are reading without realizing they are reading. Most people spend their lives focused on what to say. The people who hold rooms, who change minds, who build trust in a single conversation, they learned something different. They learned that communication is not primarily about words. It is about psychology. It is about understanding what people need to feel before they can truly hear you, and knowing exactly how to give them that feeling. This audiobook is a guide to that understanding, not the surface-level advice about speaking confidently and making eye contact. The deeper work. The psychology of how trust is built in seconds. How the framing of a sentence changes what the listener believes. How the tone of a voice communicates more than the content of the words. How silence, used correctly, is one of the most powerful tools in any conversation. Every chapter of this audiobook will take you further inside the mechanics of human communication, layer by layer, until you understand not just what to do, but why it works. If you are enjoying this audiobook and want to continue building real communication confidence, subscribe to this channel now. More chapters are coming, and each one will guide you step by step through mastering every conversation. Chapter 1. Why most people never learn to communicate powerfully. Communication is the one skill that touches every part of a human life. Every relationship, every opportunity, every conflict, every moment of connection or disconnection runs through it. And yet, it is almost never taught seriously. Not in school, where the focus is on grammar and essay structure, rather than on the live breathing, high-stakes act of being understood by another person. Not in most homes, where communication patterns are inherited rather than examined. Not in most workplaces, where the assumption seems to be that adults already know how to talk to each other, and the dysfunction is simply the cost of working with other humans. The result is a world full of intelligent, well-intentioned people who regularly fail to communicate with anything close to their actual capacity. The gap between what people intend to communicate and what actually lands in the listener is wider than almost anyone admits. Studies on communication fidelity, the degree to which the intended message is received as intended, consistently show that people dramatically overestimate how clearly their meaning has been transmitted. In one landmark study by Nicholas Epley and Justin Kruger, people estimated that their meaning was clear to listeners far more often than the listeners themselves confirmed. The senders were certain. The receivers were confused. And both parties had no idea how wide the gap was. The illusion of transparency, the feeling that your internal state and intentions are obvious to others, is one of the most consequential cognitive biases in human communication. Most people communicate the way they drive, relying on intuitions developed through experience without ever examining the underlying mechanics. They know what has worked before, and they repeat it. They know what felt uncomfortable, and they avoid it. They pick up habits from the people around them, some helpful, and many not, and carry those habits forward without the kind of deliberate reflection that would allow them to separate the useful from the counterproductive. The result is a communication style that is partly their own genuine expression and partly a collection of unexamined inheritances that may be limiting their effectiveness in ways they cannot see. The specific things that make communication powerful are not mysterious. They have been studied, mapped, and documented with considerable rigor across psychology, neuroscience, sociology, linguistics, and communication theory. The research is consistent in its major findings, even when it differs in detail. Powerful communication is not about having the right personality type. It is not limited to extroverts or natural performers or people with inherently commanding voices. It is a set of learnable skills built on an understanding of how the human brain processes information, how trust is established and broken, how emotion shapes the reception of ideas, and how the physical and contextual elements of a conversation influence its outcome. What most people substitute for genuine communication skill is a combination of performance and hope. They perform the confident posture, they hope the message lands, they observe the response, and adjust reactively rather than proactively. This approach produces inconsistent results because it treats communication as primarily a one-way transmission rather than as a dynamic process of meaning-making that happens between people. The most powerful communicators understand that their job is not to transmit information, but to create understanding, and that creating understanding requires attending to what is happening in the listener, at least as much as to what is being said by the speaker. The relationship between self-knowledge and communication skill is deeper than most people recognize at first. The person who doesn't understand their own emotional states, their own habitual patterns under pressure, their own triggers and default defenses, is working with a critical blind spot in every interaction. Their communication style is shaped by forces they cannot see, which means they cannot adjust those forces deliberately. The most powerful communicators are not people who have somehow transcended having an inner life that affects how they communicate. They are people who understand their inner life with enough clarity to work with it rather than be run by it in the middle of a conversation. Learning to communicate powerfully is also a project of unlearning, not just of adding new skills, but of examining and selectively releasing the habits, assumptions, and inherited patterns that are currently getting in the way. The person who learned that expressing uncertainty makes others trust you less. The person who learned that talking more equals being heard more. The person who learned that showing emotion in professional contexts is unprofessional. Each of these learned assumptions has a cost that may be invisible precisely because the assumption itself is invisible. The examination of these hidden rules is a significant part of what the chapters ahead are designed to support. Every powerful conversation you have ever witnessed, every leader who moved you, every speaker who changed how you thought about something, every friend whose honesty helped you see yourself more clearly, was doing something specific with the mechanics of communication. The chapters ahead are an attempt to make those specifics visible, to take what was intuited or partially understood and bring it into the clear light of deliberate understanding. Understanding the mechanics does not diminish the human experience of communication. It deepens it, because the person who understands what they are doing and why is free to bring genuine presence and creativity to every conversation in ways that the person operating entirely on inherited habit never quite can. Chapter 2. The brain behind every conversation. Before any word is spoken, two brains are already in conversation, not metaphorically, neurologically. The human brain is a social organ whose functioning changes measurably in the presence of other people. Social neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman, whose research on the social brain has reshaped understanding in this field, describes the brain as designed for social life in the same way that other organs are designed for specific biological functions. The brain at rest, the brain not directed toward any specific task, defaults to thinking about other people, what they want, what they feel, how they will respond, what they think of us. Understanding this is the first step in understanding why communication works the way it does, because you are not talking to a neutral information processor. You are talking to a system specifically evolved for the management of social relationships. The social brain has a threat detection system that operates in interpersonal contexts with the same speed and priority it gives to physical threats. Rejection by a social group activates neural pathways that overlap significantly with the pathways for physical pain. Social status threats, situations where a person feels disrespected, diminished, or publicly embarrassed, produce stress responses physiologically comparable to personal danger. This means that conversations that feel threatening to the listener, conversations that implicitly or explicitly challenge their status, competence, or sense of belonging, are conversations in which the listener's threat system is competing with their rational processing system. The person who feels socially threatened is not fully available to hear the content of what is being said because a significant portion of their cognitive resources is managing the threat. The SCARF model developed by neuroscientist David Rock identifies 5 social domains that the brain monitors continuously for threat or reward: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Each of these domains can be triggered in any conversation, and each trigger, whether toward threat or reward, has immediate effects on the listener's cognitive state. A message delivered in a way that feels threatening to the listener's status produces a different brain state and a different reception than the same message delivered in a way that signals respect and recognition. A conversation that feels unpredictable and uncertain activates the certainty domain in ways that reduce the listener's capacity for open thinking. Understanding these 5 domains gives the communicator a map of the psychological terrain they are navigating in every interaction. Mirror neurons are the neural mechanism most directly relevant to empathy in communication. When you observe another person performing an action or expressing an emotion, specialized neurons in your brain fire in patterns that partially simulate the observed experience. This neural mirroring is the biological substrate of empathy, the mechanism by which we understand other people's experiences, not just intellectually, but somatically, as a kind of felt simulation. For communicators, this means that your emotional state is not contained within you during a conversation. It is being partially transmitted to every person you are communicating with through the physical signals your body produces: facial expression, vocal tone, posture, movement. The emotional contagion that happens in groups and between people is not metaphorical. It is a direct consequence of the mirroring system. Prediction is one of the brain's primary activities in any social interaction. The brain is continuously generating predictions about what will happen next in a conversation, what the other person is about to say, what their expression will shift to, whether the interaction is moving toward connection or threat. These predictions are based on pattern recognition, and the patterns are drawn from the brain's entire history of social experience. This means that the listener's experience of a conversation is shaped not just by what is actually happening, but by what they are expecting to happen based on everything that has happened before in similar contexts. The communicator who understands this can work with expectations rather than simply hoping their actual behavior is noticed as different from the pattern the listener's brain has already begun to run. The distinction between the explicit and implicit messages in any communication is one of the most practically important things a communicator can understand. The explicit message is the content of the words, the information, the argument, the request. The implicit message is everything the words carry beneath their content. The speaker's attitude toward the listener, the speaker's attitude toward themselves, the speaker's assessment of the listener's intelligence and capability, the speaker's comfort or discomfort with what is being discussed. Research consistently shows that the implicit message has more influence on how communication is received than the explicit content, particularly in emotionally significant conversations. People remember how you made them feel far longer than they remember what you said. Cognitive load, the amount of mental effort required to process information, shapes the reception of communication in ways most speakers never consider. The listener's brain has limited processing capacity, and the conditions of a conversation, its pace, its complexity, its emotional temperature, the amount of new information being introduced, all of these affect how much of the speaker's message can actually be integrated. Communication that is delivered at a pace and complexity level that taxes the listener's processing capacity is not received with full attention. It is received in fragments, with the parts that are easiest to process gaining more attention than the parts that require the most cognitive effort. The powerful communicator calibrates to the listener's current cognitive state, rather than simply optimizing their own delivery. Every interaction leaves a neurological residue. The way a person feels after a conversation, whether they feel seen, heard, respected, engaged, or dismissed, diminished, confused, and drained, shapes how they approach the next interaction with the same person. This residue is not just emotional. It is encoded in the brain's predictive models, changing what the person expects from future interactions, and therefore changing how they listen and respond in those interactions. The communicator who understands this builds each interaction with awareness of its effect on the next one, treating every conversation not as a discrete event, but as a contribution to a cumulative relationship between two nervous systems. Chapter 3. Trust. Built in seconds, lost in an instant. Trust is the invisible foundation that every conversation is built on. Without it, the most technically perfect communication fails. With it, even imperfect, halting, imprecise communication connects. Research by social psychologist Amy Cuddy and her colleagues identified what they called the two-question framework that underlies virtually all social judgment. When we encounter someone new, We answer two questions in rapid succession, usually within seconds of the first interaction. Can I trust this person? And can I respect this person? The research is unambiguous about the order. Trust comes first. People decide whether you are trustworthy before they decide whether you are competent. And trust, once given, creates the conditions in which everything else you communicate is received more generously. The speed at which trust is formed or not formed is one of the most important and least appreciated facts about human communication. Psychologist Nalini Ambadi's research on thin slices, the way people form accurate judgments from extremely brief samples of behavior, found that people form stable impressions from as little as 2 to 30 seconds of observed behavior. These first impressions, formed before any real information about a person has been exchanged, are remarkably predictive of how the relationship will develop. This is not a superficial limitation of human judgment. It is the social brain doing its job with remarkable efficiency. The first signals it receives, the warmth or coldness in the initial greeting, the presence or absence of genuine attention, the physical ease or tension in the initial contact, these signals carry disproportionate weight in everything that follows. Warmth is the primary signal through which trustworthiness is communicated, and it is perceived through a specific set of behavioral cues that the social brain reads automatically. Genuine interest in the other person is perhaps the most powerful of these cues. Not performed interest, which most people can detect at some level of awareness, even when they cannot articulate what feels off about it, but the actual reorienting of attention toward the other person that signals you are the priority of this moment. This reorientation shows in the face, in the quality of eye contact, in the posture, in what happens to the body when the other person speaks. The communicator who can genuinely make another person feel like the most interesting person in the room has access to a form of influence that far exceeds anything technical skill can produce. Vulnerability in communication, expressed appropriately and with discernment, is one of the most reliable accelerators of trust available. Not strategic performance of vulnerability, but genuine acknowledgement of something uncertain, something imperfect, something real about the speaker's experience. Research by Harvard professor Francesca Gino on the psychology of authenticity found that people trust communicators who acknowledge limitations and uncertainties more than communicators who project seamless confidence, because the seamless confidence signals management rather than genuineness, and the social brain is tuned to detect that distinction. The communicator who can admit they do not know something, that they made a mistake, that they found something difficult, is not diminishing themselves. They are signaling that they are a person rather than a performance. Consistency is the temporal dimension of trust, and one that is built through many small interactions, rather than through any single significant demonstration. The brain builds trust through pattern recognition, and the pattern it is looking for is the alignment between what a person says and what they do, between how they present themselves and how they behave when the stakes are real. Every moment when behavior confirms stated values contributes to the pattern. Every moment when behavior contradicts them damages it. And the research is consistent that trust is lost faster than it is gained. A single clear inconsistency between word and action can undermine years of consistent behavior. in the perception of the person who observed it. Competence signals the second dimension of trust that Cuddy's framework identifies. After warmth has established baseline trustworthiness, the listener begins assessing capability. The communicator, who is genuinely warm, but perceived as lacking relevant competence, will be liked but not fully deferred to. The competence signals the brain reads most readily are not credentials and titles, though those contribute. They are behavioral. The quality of preparation evident in the communication, the specificity and accuracy of the knowledge demonstrated, the ease and fluency with which the communicator handles challenges and unexpected questions, and the coherence between the speaker's message and the larger context of what is known about the topic. Competence is performed not through displays of knowledge, but through the effortful ease of someone who has internalized what they know. Physical presence contributes to trust perception in ways that extend beyond simple attractiveness or size. The brain reads physical presence as information about internal state, and internal state as information about trustworthiness and competence. The physical markers that signal calm, settled presence, relaxed but erect posture, even breath, unhurried movement, steady and genuine eye contact, communicate to the observer's social brain that this is a person who is not in threat mode, who is not hiding something anxiety-producing, who is available for genuine contact, rather than managing an internal storm. These physical signals are read faster than words and weighted heavily in the trust assessment. The communicator whose body signals are incongruent with their verbal message will produce an experience of unease in the listener that the listener may not be able to name, but will feel as a reduction in trust. Once built, trust transforms every subsequent interaction between the same people. The listener who trusts the communicator extends charitable interpretation to ambiguous messages, assumes positive intent when intent is unclear, and gives more weight to the communicator's perspective, even when it differs from their own. The listener who does not trust the communicator does the opposite. Interprets ambiguity negatively, questions intent even when it is clear, and resists conclusions even when the reasoning is sound. This difference in the quality of reception is not about the intelligence of either party. It is about the state of the relationship that trust or its absence has established. The most important communication work any person does is the ongoing work of building and maintaining the trust that makes all subsequent communication more effective. Chapter 4. The power of listening that actually changes people. Real listening is rarer than almost any other human skill. Not the physical act of being present when someone speaks. Not the performance of attention, the nodding, the murmured affirmations, the waiting for the other person to finish, so that you can say what you planned to say before they started speaking. Real listening is the act of making the other person's meaning the primary object of your full attention, of following where they are going rather than where you expected them to go, of holding enough space around the conversation that what needs to emerge can emerge, rather than what you wanted to discuss arrives on schedule. This quality of listening is so uncommon that most people have experienced it only a handful of times in their lives, and every person who has experienced it remembers it. Research by psychologist Carl Rogers, whose work on person-centered therapy reshaped the understanding of what creates psychological change in human beings, identified what he called the core conditions of therapeutic change. Empathy, unconditional positive regard, and congruence were the three conditions that Rogers found necessary and sufficient for significant psychological change in another person. What is striking about Rogers's finding from a communication perspective is that these conditions are fundamentally about the quality of listening rather than the quality of speaking. The therapist who held these conditions did not need elaborate techniques or complex interventions. The quality of the listening itself was the intervention. The person who felt genuinely heard, without judgment, by someone who was fully present and real, changed. Active listening in its most powerful form goes beyond the reflective techniques typically taught in communication courses. Those techniques, paraphrasing back what was said, asking clarifying questions, summarizing to confirm understanding, are valuable tools when deployed genuinely rather than mechanically. But they are symptoms of real listening rather than its source. The source is the internal condition of genuine curiosity about the other person's experience, the actual wanting to know what it is like to be them in this moment, having this conversation, carrying whatever they are carrying. When that curiosity is real, the techniques arise naturally from it. When the curiosity is absent and the techniques are applied without it, the listener produces the performance of listening that most people recognize and most people resent. The most powerful thing that happens when someone feels genuinely heard is a neurological shift in their state. The perceived safety that genuine listening creates. The reduction in social threat that comes from feeling that the listener is not evaluating and judging, but genuinely attending, produces a measurable change in the quality of the listener's thinking. Ideas that felt half-formed become clearer. Feelings that were vague become specific. Problems that seemed intractable reveal angles that were not visible before. This is not a metaphor for the value of being heard. It is a description of what happens neurologically when the threat system quiets and the exploratory, creative functions of the brain become more available. The good listener creates conditions in which the person being listened to can think better. What prevents real listening is usually not indifference. Most people genuinely want to be good listeners and believe they are better at it than the evidence suggests. What prevents it is the same cognitive busyness that prevents most forms of genuine presence. The internal voice that is evaluating what is being said, planning what to say next, managing the emotional response to what is being said, editing the communication for social palatability. This internal traffic runs simultaneously with the incoming signal from the speaker and competes with it for processing resources. The person whose internal traffic is heavy is receiving a fraction of what the speaker is actually communicating. The gap between what was said and what was heard grows in proportion to the busyness of the internal voice. The physical dimension of listening is something most communication instruction neglects because it seems too simple to warrant serious attention. Where you direct your eyes, how you hold your body, whether you are facing toward or away from the speaker, the quality of stillness or restlessness in your physical presence, all of these communicate the quality of your attention before any word has been spoken. The person who is physically oriented away from the speaker while claiming to listen is sending a louder message through their body than through their words. Conversely, The physical act of turning fully toward someone, of making the adjustment that says you are now the center of my attention, produces a social signal of care and interest that the speaker receives and responds to with greater openness than they would otherwise have offered. Listening for the feeling beneath the words is the skill that separates adequate listeners from powerful ones. Most of what people say is only partially the content of the words. The rest is the emotional experience that the words are attempting to carry, sometimes imprecisely and sometimes quite obliquely. The person who describes a frustrating work situation in detail is often also carrying something about feeling unappreciated or unseen that may never be stated directly. The person who tells a funny story about something that went wrong may be managing genuine distress through humor, in a way that only becomes visible if the listener is attending to what is underneath as well as what is on the surface. The communicator who can hear and gently name the feeling beneath the stated content is doing something that most people have rarely experienced and that deepens the conversation dramatically. The paradox of powerful listening is that it makes you a more powerful speaker. The person who listens with genuine depth acquires information about the other person that most speakers never have. The specific concerns they carry, the specific language they use to organize their experience, the specific things they most need from this conversation. That information, received through real listening, enables responses that are precisely calibrated to where the other person actually is, rather than where you assumed they would be. The speaker who is also a genuine listener is never preparing a monologue. They are participating in a dialogue, shaping their contribution in real time based on what is actually happening in the conversation. And the result is communication that lands with a precision and resonance that prepared speeches rarely achieve. Chapter 5. Words that move people, the craft of language. Words are not neutral. They do not simply carry meaning the way a container carries water. They shape meaning. They prime specific conceptual frameworks. They activate emotional associations. They signal relationships and power dynamics. They invite certain responses and foreclose others. Two sentences that convey the same factual information can produce entirely different experiences in the listener, depending on the specific words chosen, the order in which the words appear, and the framing that surrounds the core content. Understanding this is not the beginning of manipulation. It is the beginning of genuine responsibility for the actual effect of your language, rather than just the intended content of it. Framing is the most studied and most consistently powerful linguistic mechanism in communication. The same information, framed differently, produces measurably different responses. In one of the most replicated demonstrations in the behavioral science literature, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman showed that people's choices between identical options changed dramatically, depending on whether the options were framed in terms of gains or losses. A medical treatment described as having a 90% survival rate was chosen significantly more often than the same treatment described as having a 10% mortality rate, even though the information is logically equivalent. The frame activated different emotional processing, and the emotional processing drove the choice. For communicators, the practical implication is direct. The frame you choose is not decoration around your message. It is a structural element of what the listener actually hears. Concrete language outperforms abstract language in almost every communication goal, from persuasion to memorability to emotional engagement. The brain processes concrete language through sensory and motor systems that abstract language does not activate. When you say the cold glass against her palm, the reader's brain partially simulates the sensation. When you say she was uncomfortable, it does not. The concrete experience creates a richer, more immersive neural event, which means it is processed more deeply, remembered more readily, and felt more fully than its abstract equivalent. Powerful communicators instinctively reach for the specific, the tangible, the sensory, and the particular, rather than the general and the abstract. They know that the concrete detail carries more persuasive weight than the general principle it illustrates. Narrative is the frame that human brains were most fundamentally built to receive. Before humans had writing, before the elaboration of formal logical argument, humans communicated, learned, and transmitted cultural knowledge through story. The brain's engagement with a well-told story is measurably different from its engagement with presented information. Neural coupling, the degree to which the listener's brain activity aligns with the speaker's, is significantly stronger during narrative communication than during expository communication. The listener who is following a story is not just processing information. They are inhabiting an experience, and the behavioral and attitudinal effects of inhabited experience are more durable than the effects of processed information. The specific language of emotions is more powerful than the language of logic in most communication contexts where change is the goal. This is not because logic is unimportant. It is because emotion is the gateway through which information must pass to reach the parts of the brain that make decisions and drive behavior. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's research on patients with damage to the prefrontal cortex, specifically the areas that process emotion and integrate it with decision-making, demonstrated that people who could reason perfectly well, but who could not access emotional responses, made extraordinarily poor decisions in real life. Emotion is not the enemy of good thinking. It is a necessary component of the connection between thinking and action. The communicator who speaks only to the rational mind is missing the mechanism that translates reasoning into behavior. Questions are one of the most underutilized tools in the communicator's repertoire. The well-chosen question does something no statement can do. It makes the listener the author of the insight. When a person generates a conclusion through their own reasoning, in response to a question that opened the right line of thinking, they own that conclusion in a way they would not own the same conclusion delivered as a statement. The ownership effect is not just psychological, it is neurological. The brain's reward system responds differently to self-generated insights than to received information. The good question creates the conditions for that self-generated insight, which means the persuasive work is done by the listener's own brain rather than by the speaker's arguments. Rhythm and cadence in spoken language carry meaning that the words themselves do not contain. The pace of speech signals emotional state and cognitive confidence. The deliberate pause before a key phrase signals that what follows is important. The variation in pitch that marks the difference between a statement and a genuine question affects whether the listener experiences the speaker as certain or exploratory. The length of sentences shapes the emotional texture of what is communicated. Short sentences carry urgency and emphasis. Longer sentences carry nuance and qualification. These prosodic elements of spoken communication are processed by the listener continuously and often more powerfully than the semantic content they accompany. The powerful communicator attends to the music of their language as deliberately as to the meaning of their words. The gap between the words you mean and the words the listener hears can be closed significantly by developing the practice of attending to the listener's response as closely as to your own delivery. The listener who nods with a certain quality is not necessarily understanding. The listener who says yes repeatedly may be managing the conversation rather than engaging with it. The listener whose questions take the conversation in a direction you did not anticipate is telling you something important about what they are actually hearing rather than what you intended to say. The communicator who is watching and reading these signals adjusts their language in real time to close the gap between what is being sent and what is being received, which is the fundamental act of genuine communication as distinct from mere speaking. Chapter 6. The Voice. Your most underestimated tool. If you could hear yourself the way others hear you, it would change how you communicate permanently. Most people have a distorted experience of their own voice, shaped partly by the different way sound is conducted through bone versus air, and partly by the simple fact that they are inside the experience of speaking rather than outside it in the listener's position. But the voice, as received by listeners, is doing an enormous amount of communicative work that most speakers are not consciously directing. It is communicating confidence and uncertainty, warmth and distance, authority and deference, energy and depletion, all before the listener has processed the semantic content of a single sentence. The voice is not the delivery vehicle for the message. In many conversations, the voice is the message. Research on vocal characteristics and their social reception has produced findings that are both surprising in their specificity and entirely consistent with lived experience. Psychologist Nalini Ambadi and her colleagues found that thin slices of a physician's voice, the nonverbal qualities of tone, pace, and warmth, stripped of the actual content of the words, could predict whether that physician had been sued for malpractice significantly better than chance. The physicians who were sued were not necessarily less competent. Their voices communicated something about their relationship to the patient, a quality of distance or condescension or impatience that the patients responded to at a level below full conscious processing. The voice was telling a story the words were not telling, and that story determined outcomes. Breathing is the foundation of effective vocal communication, and the dimension that most speakers have never deliberately examined. The voice is produced by airflow, and the quality of the airflow determines the quality of the voice in ways that go far beyond simple volume. Shallow chest breathing produces a voice that sounds higher in pitch, thinner in resonance, and more anxious in character than diaphragmatic breathing. The breath that fills the belly and lower lungs gives the vocal folds more consistent airflow, which produces a rounder, more resonant sound with more stable pitch. The speaker who has learned to breathe fully before and during speaking does not just sound more confident. They are more confident because the physiological state that full diaphragmatic breathing produces is genuinely calmer and more regulated than the state shallow breathing maintains. Pace is perhaps the most universally mismanaged aspect of vocal delivery. The experience of nervousness, excitement, or the pressure to fill silence accelerates speech in most people beyond the rate at which it can be received comfortably by listeners. Research on speech comprehension shows that listeners have an optimal processing rate that varies somewhat by individual, but for most people falls well below the rate at which most nervous speakers deliver. The slower speaker is not just easier to understand. They are more readily perceived as confident, authoritative, and thoughtful, because speaking at a measured pace signals that the speaker is not driven by anxiety to fill the space as quickly as possible. The deliberate pause, in particular, is a mark of genuine power in vocal communication. The speaker who pauses before responding to a question is communicating that they are taking the question seriously. The speaker who answers instantly is communicating that they had the answer prepared before the question was complete. Vocal variety is what separates engaging from monotonous delivery and what keeps listener attention across extended communication. The brain is calibrated to attend to change and to habituate to consistency. The voice that maintains the same pitch, pace, and volume throughout a presentation is providing no variation signal for the brain to attend to, which means the brain gradually reduces its allocation of processing resources to the incoming signal. The voice that moves, that rises in pitch for emphasis and drops to signal gravity, that accelerates through familiar material and slows for complex or important points, that uses volume dynamically rather than maintaining a uniform level, is continuously giving the listener's brain new variation to track. Engagement is not the product of content alone. It is the product of a vocal delivery that maintains the conditions for attention. The emotional channel that the voice carries is one that most communicators have never deliberately worked with, and that all listeners are continuously reading. Research on vocal emotion recognition shows that people identify emotional states from voice alone, without seeing the speaker's face or understanding the words, with remarkable accuracy across cultures. Joy, sadness, anger, fear, contempt, and warmth each have characteristic vocal signatures, patterns of pitch, resonance, rhythm, and breathiness that the listener's brain identifies at a level that precedes conscious processing. This means that the speaker who is communicating warmth, but whose voice is carrying impatience, is broadcasting both signals simultaneously, and the listener is receiving both, with the nonverbal signal often carrying more weight than the intended message. Working deliberately with the voice requires exactly the same graduated practice approach that any other complex skill requires. Recording yourself and listening with genuine curiosity about what a new listener would experience. Practicing the deliberate pause in low-stakes conversations before relying on it in high-stakes ones. Experimenting with pace variation to discover what feels natural at different intensities. Attending to where in the body the voice is originating, and practicing the shift from chest and throat to the fuller resonance of diaphragmatic support. These are not exercises for performers. They are practices for anyone who communicates in situations where the quality of the experience they create for the listener matters, which includes every person in every meaningful relationship and every professional context. The voice you use by default is not necessarily the voice that serves you best in every context. The voice that works well in intimate conversation does not necessarily serve a large room. The voice calibrated for a competitive professional environment may carry qualities of defensiveness or aggression that undermine trust in a collaborative one. Developing range in vocal communication. The ability to modulate your voice deliberately across different contexts and purposes is not inauthentic. It is the vocal equivalent of what skilled writers call register. The ability to match the qualities of your expression to the requirements of the context and the needs of the audience. The voice that can move between registers, that is responsive to context rather than fixed in a single mode, is a voice that serves more of the situations a full human life contains. Chapter 7. Body Language. The conversation beneath the conversation. At any given moment in a conversation, two conversations are happening simultaneously. The first is the one both participants are aware of. The words, the ideas, the explicit content being exchanged. The second is the one happening below the level of conscious attention, but shaping the experience of the first conversation in real time. This second conversation happens entirely through the body. Posture, gesture, facial expression, the direction and quality of eye contact, the physical distance between people, the orientation of the feet, the behavior of the hands. These signals are being sent and received continuously, processed by social brain systems that have been doing this work for the entire history of the species. The body does not lie as easily as the mouth does, which is why skilled social readers often know things about your emotional state before you have chosen to tell them. Posture is the physical statement of your relationship to the space you occupy, and, by extension, to the interaction you are in. Expansive, open posture, spine erect, shoulders back and down, chest open, limbs uncrossed and unhurried, communicates a combination of ease and confidence that the social brain reads as belonging and authority. Contracted, closed posture, shoulders forward and raised, chest caved, limbs crossed and held close, communicates threat vigilance and social discomfort. These readings happen automatically and contribute to the listener's impression before any verbal communication has occurred. What makes posture particularly interesting as a communication variable is that it also affects the speaker. Research by Amy Cuddy and others on the bidirectional relationship between posture and psychological state shows that adopting expansive posture produces physiological changes, reduced cortisol, increased testosterone, that influence the speaker's actual confidence rather than just its performance. Eye contact is among the most culturally complex and individually variable of the nonverbal signals, which makes general statements about it more hazardous than for most other physical communication variables. Within cultures that treat direct eye contact as normative, the research is consistent. Too little eye contact is perceived as shifty, disengaged, or untrustworthy, while sustained genuine eye contact is perceived as attentive, sincere, and confident. But the distinction between genuine eye contact and staring is important and often missed. The eye contact that builds connection has a quality of soft focus and genuine interest. It includes the micro movements and blinks of natural human gaze, and it does not maintain fixed, unblinking contact that shifts from connection to challenge. The powerful communicator uses eye contact to signal genuine attention rather than to establish dominance. Gesture is the physical amplifier of spoken language and a communicative channel that, when used naturally and congruently, increases both the memorability of what is said and the speaker's perceived credibility. Research on gesture and communication found that when speakers gesture naturally, in ways that are congruent with their verbal content, listeners understand and retain the information better than when the same content is delivered without gesture. The mechanism appears to involve the listener's motor system, which partially simulates the gesture, and in doing so creates a richer encoding of the associated information. The communicator who has learned to gesture naturally, whose hands express the ideas they are discussing, rather than managing self-consciousness, is using an additional channel of meaning-making that dramatically increases their communicative impact. The geography of a conversation, the physical arrangement of the participants in space, communicates a relationship and creates an experience before a word is spoken. Research on proxemics, the study of how people use physical space in social contexts, identified zones of comfortable distance that vary by relationship type and cultural context. Standing at an appropriate distance for the relationship and context communicates awareness and respect. Invading closer space without invitation produces discomfort. Standing at an uncomfortable distance creates coldness. The communicator who is attuned to the spatial dimension of their interactions, who notices when someone has stepped back slightly and understands what that might be communicating, who can read the physical geography of a room and position themselves within it effectively, is working with a powerful layer of communicative information that most people ignore entirely. Facial expression is the most heavily studied and most socially significant channel of nonverbal communication. Paul Ekman's decades of research on facial expression and emotion mapped the basic emotional expressions with enough specificity to show that they are recognized across cultures with remarkable consistency. Happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and contempt each have a characteristic pattern of muscle activation that the social brain reads automatically in the faces of others. What makes facial expression particularly important for communicators is that it is difficult to control consciously with the degree of precision required to fully override the genuine emotional signal. The suppressed negative emotion leaks through micro-expressions, flashes of genuine expression so brief that most people never consciously perceive them, but that the social brain processes and uses to update its assessment of the speaker's trustworthiness. Congruence between all channels of nonverbal communication is what produces the experience of genuine presence. The person whose face, body, gesture, and voice are all telling the same story, all reflecting the same internal state, is experienced as real, as whole, as authentic. The person whose channels are incongruent, whose words say one thing while the voice carries a different emotional tone, and the body holds a different posture, and the face shows yet a different expression, produces an experience of unease in the listener that they often cannot name, but that reliably reduces trust. The powerful communicator is not someone who has learned to perform a set of approved nonverbal behaviors. They are someone whose work on their own emotional regulation and genuine presence has produced an inner state that expresses congruently through every channel without requiring conscious management of each one. Reading the nonverbal communication of others is the complementary skill to managing your own. The communicator who can detect the slight shift in posture that signals discomfort, the micro expression of contempt that passed before the agreeable words arrived, the hand that moved toward the door before the conversation was officially over, the quality of eye contact that signals distraction, has access to real-time information about the state of the conversation that the speaker, who is only attending to verbal content, never gets. This reading is not manipulation, and it is not surveillance. It is genuine attunement. The same attunement that characterizes all deeply effective interpersonal communication, and that is built through the combination of genuine curiosity about the other person and sustained practice of paying attention to all the channels through which they are communicating. Chapter 8. Difficult Conversations and the Courage They Require. The conversations most people most want to have are the ones they most reliably avoid. The feedback that would help, and that is not being given. The concern that has been building for months that has never been named. The disagreement that has been managed around rather than through. The relationship difficulty that everyone in the room can feel, and that no one is willing to address directly. The avoidance is not irrational. Difficult conversations carry real risks. The risk of damaging the relationship, the risk of being wrong, the risk of the other person's emotional response, the risk of opening something that cannot be closed again. But the avoided difficult conversation also carries costs that accumulate with time. The eroding trust of unaddressed problems, the growing distance of unspoken truths, the decision-making that happens in the absence of honest information. Researcher Douglas Stone and his colleagues at the Harvard Negotiation Project identified a structure within most difficult conversations that, once understood, makes them significantly more navigable. Every difficult conversation contains 3 simultaneous conversations happening at once. The first is the "what happened" conversation, which involves the facts, the interpretations, and the disagreement about who did what and what it means. The second is the feelings conversation, which involves the emotional experience each person is having, and the question of whether those feelings are valid and relevant. The third is the identity conversation, which involves what each person is concluding about themselves and their own adequacy based on what is happening in the first 2 conversations. Most people navigate difficult conversations while being aware only of the first one, and while being significantly driven by the second and third without knowing it. Entering a difficult conversation in the stance of curiosity rather than certainty is the single most significant adjustment that changes the quality of what unfolds. The person who enters with certainty about what happened, who was at fault, and what needs to happen next has already concluded the conversation in their own mind before having it. What follows is not a conversation but a performance of one, in which the other person is being offered the opportunity to confirm what has already been decided. The person who enters with genuine curiosity, who holds their own interpretation of events as one possible interpretation, rather than as the truth, who is genuinely interested in learning what the situation looks like from the other person's position, creates conditions in which the conversation can produce something neither person had when they entered it. The specific language of difficult conversations matters more than most people realize, because language shapes not just what is communicated, but how it is received. The difference between "you never listen to me" and "I feel unheard when this happens" is not just stylistic. The first statement makes a global claim about the other person's character that activates defensiveness. The second describes the speaker's experience without making claims about the other person's intentions or character, which creates more space for the other person to receive what is being said without immediately defending against it. The research on what is called non-violent communication by Marshall Rosenberg provides a framework for expressing genuine experience, including difficult experience, in language that is more likely to be heard than language that assigns blame or makes generalizations. The management of your own emotional state during a difficult conversation is a precondition for the conversation going well, rather than an added challenge on top of it. When your own emotional system is activated, your ability to think clearly, to hear what the other person is actually saying, rather than the version that confirms your existing interpretation, and to maintain the curiosity and care that the conversation requires, is compromised. The pause, the breath, the deliberate slowing of pace, the brief noticing and naming of your own emotional experience before responding. All of the emotion regulation practices described in other chapters of this book become mission critical in the middle of a difficult conversation. The person who can self-regulate in those moments has access to a quality of thinking and presence that the activated person does not. Repair after a difficult conversation that did not go well is itself a form of powerful communication that most people undervalue. The quality of repair, how a relationship recovers from moments of conflict or rupture, may be more important to the long-term health of the relationship than the frequency or intensity of the difficult moments. Research by John Gottman on relationship dynamics found that the ratio of positive to negative interactions was predictive of relationship stability, but also that the specific capacity for repair, for moving from rupture back toward connection, was a critical distinguishing factor in relationships that thrived versus those that deteriorated. The difficult conversation that ends badly but is followed by genuine repair teaches both parties something about the resilience of the relationship that no perfectly managed difficult conversation can teach. Some difficult conversations require going first, not because it is your responsibility to fix everything, but because someone has to open the door, and it is not going to open itself. The person who says, "I want to talk about something that has been difficult for me to bring up," is doing several things at once. They are modeling the courage of naming the difficulty. They are giving the other person information about the emotional significance of what follows. They are creating a container for the conversation by naming its nature before its content. And they are demonstrating that the relationship matters enough to them to take the interpersonal risk of being the one to break the ice. Going first in a difficult conversation is not a guarantee of a good outcome, but it is frequently the only thing that makes a good outcome possible. Every difficult conversation you navigate successfully adds to your capacity for the next one, not because they become less difficult in the emotional sense. Some of the most important difficult conversations of a life are among the hardest things a person ever does. But the evidence accumulates that difficult conversations are survivable, that relationships can hold honest exchange, that the things that were frightening to say out loud were often received differently than the fear predicted, and that the temporary discomfort of a difficult conversation is almost always preferable to the long-term cost of the conversation avoided. The communicator who has built this evidence base approaches the difficult conversations of their life with a steadiness that comes not from fearlessness, but from experience of having navigated them before. Chapter 9. Influence without manipulation. Influence is one of the most uncomfortable words in the vocabulary of communication. It carries the shadow of manipulation, of being moved without knowing you were moved, of having your choices shaped by forces you did not consent to. This discomfort is not unreasonable. The history of persuasion and influence includes extensive evidence of its misuse, from propaganda to deceptive advertising to the deliberate exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities. But the discomfort around influence, taken too far, produces the equally problematic conclusion that any attempt to shape another person's thinking or behavior is suspect, which is both incoherent and disempowering. Every act of communication is an attempt to affect another person in some way. The question is not whether to influence, but how, and by what means, and in whose genuine interest. The distinction between ethical influence and manipulation is not always clear at the edges, but is clear enough at the center to be practically useful. Ethical influence works by making the most genuinely relevant information and perspective available to the person making a decision in forms that they can actually receive and process, and by doing so, in the service of outcomes that genuinely benefit them as well as the influencer. Manipulation works by bypassing the other person's rational agency, by exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, by withholding or distorting information, by using pressure rather than reasoning, by prioritizing the influencer's interests at the other person's expense. The powerful communicator does not need manipulation because genuine ethical influence, applied skillfully, is powerful enough for any legitimate purpose. Robert Cialdini's research on the principles of social influence, documented in his landmark book on the subject, identified 6 principles that reliably increase compliance with requests: reciprocity, commitment and consistency, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity. These principles are not inherently manipulative. They are descriptions of how the brain processes social information and makes decisions. A doctor who is genuinely more experienced in a relevant area is appropriately invoking authority. A product that is genuinely popular is appropriately invoking social proof. The manipulation occurs when these principles are invoked falsely or deceptively, when the authority is fabricated, when the social proof is manufactured, when the scarcity is artificial. Used honestly, in the service of helping people make decisions that genuinely benefit them, these same principles are legitimate tools of effective communication. The most durable influence is the kind that changes what people think rather than just what they do. Behavioral compliance in the absence of genuine conviction is fragile. The person who is persuaded to take an action without genuinely changing the underlying belief or value that drives action will tend to revert to previous behavior when the persuasive pressure is removed, or when the cost of the prescribed behavior rises. The influence that operates at the level of meaning that helps the other person see something differently rather than just act differently produces change that is owned by the person rather than imposed on them. This kind of influence is slower and harder to produce than behavioral compliance, but it is real change rather than performance of change. Asking questions is often more influential than making arguments, and this is one of the most counterintuitive findings in persuasion research. The communicator who asks a well-chosen question that causes the listener to reason their way to a conclusion is producing a more persuasive outcome than the communicator who delivers the same conclusion as an argument, because the self-generated insight is experienced as the listener's own thinking rather than as an external position to be accepted or rejected. This approach, sometimes called the Socratic method in educational contexts, is not a technique for avoiding honesty. It is a recognition that the most respected and lasting influence is the kind that helps people think more clearly rather than the kind that tells them what to think. Narrative influence is worth examining in its own right because it operates through a different psychological mechanism than logical argument and produces effects that logical argument often cannot. Research on narrative transportation, the degree to which a person becomes absorbed in a story, shows that the more transported a listener is into a narrative, the less counter-arguing they do, and the more their attitudes and beliefs align with the world the narrative depicts. This is not because stories bypass reason. It is because stories create an experiential context that allows the listener to encounter ideas in a way that feels immediate and real, rather than abstract and theoretical. The ethical use of this power involves using it to convey genuine truth, rather than to bypass critical thinking in the service of false conclusions. Timing matters enormously in influence. The same message, delivered at different moments in a person's decision-making process, has different effects because the cognitive and emotional state associated with different moments in that process creates different openness to different kinds of input. Research on windows of receptivity in decision-making shows that people are most open to new information and perspectives early in their consideration of a decision, and least open when they have already committed to a course of action. The communicator who times their influential contribution for the early window is working with the natural flow of the decision process. The communicator who attempts influence after commitment has been made is fighting the psychological forces of consistency and confirmation bias that the commitment activated. The most powerful influence any person can have is the influence of being genuinely trustworthy. The person whose word means something, whose stated intentions match their actual behavior, whose communication is reliably honest, even when honesty is costly, exercises a form of influence that does not require technique or strategy, because it has already established the conditions in which their communication is given significant weight. Every other principle of influence described in this chapter operates more powerfully in the context of a foundation of trust than it does without it, and every technique of influence loses its power quickly when the person employing it is not fundamentally trustworthy. The investment in trust, described in Chapter 3, is therefore the most important investment in influence that any communicator can make. Chapter 10. Communication in groups, meetings, rooms, and crowds. The dynamics of communication change fundamentally when a third person enters the conversation. What was an exchange between two nervous systems becomes a social system with its own properties, its own norms, its own status hierarchy, and its own collective emotional atmosphere that no single participant fully controls. Group communication is not simply individual communication done with more people. It involves entirely different psychological processes: social comparison, conformity pressure, groupthink, deference to perceived authority, in-group signaling, and the diffusion of responsibility that distributes accountability for ideas and outcomes across the group in ways that change how any individual member relates to what is being said and decided. The communicator who understands these dynamics is equipped to navigate group settings with a sophistication that most participants never develop. Status and its management is the invisible architecture of every group communication setting. Research on group dynamics consistently shows that people communicate differently depending on their perceived status in the group relative to others, and that perceived status is often established and communicated through nonverbal signals before any verbal content has been exchanged. The person who enters a room slowly, who speaks without rushing, who pauses comfortably before responding, who takes up physical space without apology, and who maintains calm eye contact is signaling high status through every one of these behaviors. The person who enters quickly, speaks rapidly, fills silence compulsively, makes themselves physically small, and breaks eye contact under pressure is signaling lower status. The status signals affect how the group receives everything that follows from both speakers. The meeting is the dominant group communication format in most professional lives and one of the most poorly managed. Research on meeting effectiveness consistently finds that most meetings fail on their primary purpose, which is the generation of better decisions and better action than would have been produced without the meeting, because they are structured in ways that activate the wrong psychological processes. The typical meeting activates performance and status management behaviors, rather than genuine collaborative thinking. The presence of hierarchy silences people who might have the most useful contribution. The format of going around the table produces responses shaped by what has already been said, rather than genuine, independent thinking. The absence of deliberate psychological safety allows the fear of being wrong to suppress the honest assessment that would have been most useful. Speaking up in a group, whether to offer an idea, to raise a concern, or to disagree with the prevailing direction, requires a specific kind of courage that is distinct from the courage required in one-on-one communication. The social cost of dissent in a group is felt not just as the displeasure of one person, but as the potential disruption of the group's cohesion and forward motion. Research on the spiral of silence, the tendency for minority opinions to become less audible over time as their holders perceive themselves to be in the minority and adjust toward the apparent majority position, shows how powerful this social pressure is. The communicator who has learned to speak up in groups despite this pressure, who has developed the ability to frame dissent in ways that are genuinely additive rather than merely oppositional, provides a service to the group that most members are silently grateful for, even when the speaking up is momentarily uncomfortable. The first mover advantage in group communication is one of the most consistently demonstrated phenomena in the social influence literature. The first opinion stated in a group discussion has disproportionate influence on subsequent contributions because it sets an anchor that later responses are assessed relative to. The first person to propose a number in a negotiation, the first person to offer an interpretation of ambiguous information, the first person to suggest a direction. When the group is undecided, each of these first movers shifts the probability distribution of subsequent discussion toward their starting point. This is not because first movers are more right than later speakers. It is because the social brain uses the first available position as a reference point. Understanding this, the powerful group communicator chooses when to speak first and when to wait with equal deliberateness. Facilitation, the practice of creating conditions in which a group can communicate and decide more effectively, is a high-leverage communication skill that is largely self-taught in most organizational contexts and therefore largely poor. The facilitator who understands the psychological dynamics of groups can design the structure of a group communication event in ways that counteract the worst tendencies, explicitly inviting dissent, using anonymous input mechanisms to separate ideas from status, creating structured opportunities for independent thinking before group discussion, managing the time and pacing of discussion to ensure all voices get access, and naming the group process dynamics when they are getting in the way. The poorly facilitated meeting is not just a waste of time. It actively produces worse outcomes than individual thinking would have, because the group dynamics amplified the loudest voice rather than the best thinking. Rooms have cultures, and those cultures shape what communication is possible in them. The room where humor is safe produces different communication than the room where earnestness is the only acceptable register. The room where disagreement has historically been welcome produces different communication than the room where agreement is the social contract. The room where one person's status is significantly higher than all others produces different communication than the room where status differences are smaller. The powerful communicator in a group setting understands the culture of the room they are in, adjusts their communication to be effective within that culture, and when they have the authority to do so, works deliberately to shift the culture toward one that enables better communication and better thinking. The public speaking context is the group communication setting that most people fear above any other. Fear of public speaking consistently ranks among the most commonly reported human fears. And the physiological experience of addressing a large group, the elevated heart rate, the dry mouth, the trembling that can precede the first words, is undeniably real. But the fear is rarely about the act of speaking itself. It is about the social evaluation, the sense of being fully exposed to the judgment of many observers simultaneously. Understanding this accurately changes what needs to be addressed. The solution to fear of public speaking is not the performance of confidence. It is the development of genuine connection with the audience, the reorientation from performing for them to communicating with them, which transforms the dynamic from evaluation to shared experience and transforms the speaker's experience from threat to engagement. Chapter 11. Digital Communication, What the Screen Hides and What It Reveals. The screen has become the dominant medium of communication for most people in the developed world, and its specific properties shape communication in ways that most users have never examined deliberately. Digital communication strips away the richest channels of human communication: the vocal tone, the facial expression, the physical presence, the real-time feedback loop that allows a speaker to adjust to a listener's response in the moment. What remains in text-based digital communication is primarily semantic content, which research on in-person communication consistently shows is the smallest component of the full communicative signal. The result is a medium in which misunderstanding is dramatically more likely, in which the emotional tone of a message is systematically ambiguous, and in which the absence of reciprocal cues produces a fundamentally different psychological experience than real-time interaction. The specific cognitive load that text-based communication imposes is worth understanding because it shapes behavior in ways that users rarely recognize. Reading text requires the reader to construct the speaker's voice, tone, emotional state, and intent from the raw material of the words alone. This construction is effortful and error-prone because the reader draws on their own emotional state, their history with the sender, and the general context to fill in the missing channels with inferences that may not be accurate. Research on the over-inference of hostility in ambiguous digital messages shows that people consistently read negative intent into emotionally neutral messages, particularly under conditions of stress or pre-existing interpersonal tension. The message that was perfectly neutral to its sender arrived as aggressive to its reader, and neither party knows why the conversation suddenly became tense. Response time in digital communication carries a social signal that the sender experiences as intentional, even when it is not. The text message that goes unanswered for several hours is interpreted as a statement about the priority of the relationship, regardless of whether the recipient was simply unavailable. The email that receives an immediate response communicates a different relationship than the email that waits 3 days. The person who manages digital response time deliberately, who understands that their patterns of response are themselves a form of communication, is working with a layer of the digital channel that most users leave entirely to accident. The deliberate management of response time, either by responding promptly to signal genuine attention, or by taking time before a complex or emotionally charged response to ensure the response is the one they actually want to send, is a form of communicative skill that the reactive user never develops. The absence of the real-time adjustment mechanism in digital communication makes explicit what the in-person communicator can leave implicit. In a face-to-face conversation, a confused expression prompts a spontaneous clarification. A tense posture prompts a reassuring shift. A moment of genuine laughter confirms that the humor landed appropriately. None of these adjustment signals exist in asynchronous digital communication. The sender is working in the dark, sending a message, and waiting, with no feedback about how it is landing until the response arrives, which may be hours or days later. This absence requires the skilled digital communicator to do something the in-person communicator can leave to the feedback loop, anticipating the reader's likely interpretation and building the clarity that would otherwise be achieved through real-time adjustment directly into the composition of the message. Tone in digital text is one of the most consistently mismanaged elements of written communication. What reads as confident to the sender reads as arrogant to the receiver. What reads as efficient to the sender reads as cold to the receiver. What reads as direct to the sender reads as aggressive to the receiver. These divergences are not accidents of individual misinterpretation. They are systematic consequences of the absence of the vocal and physical channels that disambiguate tone in real-time communication. The skilled digital communicator develops habits of composition that build tone explicitly into the text. The specific acknowledgement before the critical feedback, the warmer opening that signals relationship before getting to business, the careful choice between a period and a question mark that completely changes the emotional register of a sentence. Video communication is not a simple proxy for in-person communication, and the specific ways it differs from both in-person and text-based interaction produce their own communicative challenges. The camera's placement, typically at eye level or slightly below, means that looking at the other person's image, rather than into the camera, creates the impression of avoiding eye contact, inverting the most fundamental, nonverbal signal of attentiveness. The latency of even brief audio delay fundamentally disrupts the conversational rhythm that in-person interaction relies on for smooth turn-taking. The rectangle of the video frame artificially constrains physical presence in ways that eliminate much of the gestural and postural communication that in-person interaction contains. The skilled video communicator compensates for each of these constraints with deliberate adjustments that most users have never made because they have never examined the ways their video presence differs from their in-person one. Digital communication creates its own forms of miscommunication that have no precise equivalent in earlier communication history. The archive is one of the most psychologically significant. Every digital message potentially exists permanently, searchable and quotable, in a way that conversational speech does not. This permanence changes the stakes of communication in ways that both liberate and constrain. The person who knows their message will be archived may communicate more carefully and accurately than they would in speech. They may also communicate more defensively, more formally, with less genuine spontaneity, producing a digital record that is precise but less alive than the communication it attempts to document. The skilled digital communicator holds this tension consciously, choosing when the archival quality is an asset and when it is a constraint worth working around through a real-time conversation. The most significant limitation of digital communication is not technical, but human. The reduction in channel richness strips away the cues that support genuine empathy. The asynchronous format removes the mutual vulnerability of real-time presence. The text-based medium invites performance of a self rather than genuine expression of one. The result is that digital communication, for all its convenience and reach, tends to deepen existing relationships less effectively than in-person communication and to build new relationships more slowly. The communicator who understands this limitation does not abandon digital communication, which is both inevitable and genuinely useful for many purposes. They use it with awareness of what it cannot do, and they protect and invest in the in-person and real-time interactions that digital communication cannot replace. Chapter 12. The communicator you are becoming. Communication mastery is not a destination. It is a direction. The person who has genuinely committed to developing as a communicator does not arrive at a point where the learning is complete and the practice is behind them. They arrive at progressively more interesting and more demanding levels of the work, where the skills they have built become the foundation for understanding nuances they could not previously perceive and engaging with challenges they were not previously equipped to navigate. The communicator who has been practicing for years sees things in a conversation that the beginner cannot see, hears things in a voice that the untrained ear cannot hear, and has access to choices in the moment that the reactive communicator has not yet developed. This accumulated capacity is real, and it is the product of exactly the kind of sustained, deliberate practice that this book has been pointing toward throughout. The single most powerful thing that separates people who keep improving as communicators from those who plateau is the relationship with feedback. The person who treats every conversation as an opportunity to learn something about how their communication is landing, who actively seeks honest assessment from people they trust, who can hear critical feedback about their communication style without defensiveness that would prevent the feedback from changing anything, is on a trajectory of continuous improvement. The person who interprets every conversation through the lens of whether they performed well rather than whether they communicated effectively, who protects their self-image at the cost of genuine development, is on a trajectory of comfortable stagnation. The feedback is always available. The willingness to receive it is the variable. Genuine presence is the quality that underlies every other skill described in this book, and it is worth addressing directly at the end, because it is both the foundation of everything and the thing that cannot be achieved through technique alone. Presence is not a performance. It is the actual orientation of your full attention toward the person you are with and the conversation you are in, rather than toward the performance of communication, the management of impression, or the internal traffic of self-monitoring and self-assessment. The person who is genuinely present in a conversation, whose attention is actually here, rather than divided between the interaction and the observation of it, communicates something that no amount of technical skill can replicate. People feel when they are in the presence of genuine attention. They feel when they are not. The feeling shapes everything that happens between them. Developing genuine presence is, paradoxically, partly a function of working through all the technical skill building that this book describes. When communication skills are underdeveloped, the person's attention is consumed by managing the mechanics, trying to remember how to listen actively, while also tracking whether they are maintaining appropriate eye contact, while also managing what they are about to say. As skills become more automatic, as the mechanics require less conscious effort, more of the person's attention becomes available for actual presence. The technical training is, in part, the clearing of space for genuine presence to operate. The beginner who doesn't know how to listen actively cannot be fully present. The practiced communicator whose listening has become natural can be. Curiosity about other people is perhaps the most sustainable fuel for continued growth as a communicator, and it is a quality that either exists or needs to be cultivated deliberately. The person who is genuinely fascinated by other people, by the particular combination of experience and perspective that makes each person's internal world irreducibly different from everyone else's, naturally develops communication skills in service of that fascination. They listen more carefully because they actually want to understand. They observe more acutely because they are genuinely interested in what they are seeing. They ask better questions because the answers actually matter to them. The curiosity is not a communication technique. It is the condition from which genuine communication most naturally and most powerfully flows. The ethical dimension of communication mastery is worth naming directly because It is the thing that determines whether the skills developed through a practice like this are a contribution to the world or a cost to it. The same skills that allow a person to build trust rapidly, to listen deeply, to speak persuasively, to navigate difficult conversations with skill, to move groups toward better thinking, can be used to serve the genuine interests of the people they are communicating with, or to exploit those people for purposes they would not endorse if they could see them clearly. The choice of how to use these skills is made not once, but continuously in every conversation, and it is a choice that reflects the character of the person, making it more than any other dimension of their communication practice. The people who will change your life through conversation have not all entered it yet. The mentor who will say something that reframes everything. The colleague whose honest feedback will redirect a trajectory. The friend whose willingness to have the difficult conversation will save something important. The stranger on a plane whose question will stay with you for years. These conversations will happen not because you sought them, but because you were present enough to be in them when they arrived. The communicator who has developed genuine presence, honest expression, real listening, and the courage for difficult exchange is the person to whom these conversations are available. Not because they deserve them more than anyone else, but because they are positioned to receive them. Every conversation you have from this point forward is an opportunity to practice something from what you have read here, not the whole book in every exchange. One thing: the deliberate pause before responding, the genuine curiosity about the other person's experience, the specific name for the emotion that is arising, the question instead of the statement, the full breath before the difficult word, the physical orientation of genuine attention. These small practices, applied to the ordinary conversations of ordinary days, build something that cannot be built through reading alone. They build the communicator who does not just know about these things, but who is these things, whose understanding has become character, whose skill has become presence, and whose presence is the most powerful communication available to any human being.